I may defer to Dr. Crisp on occasion here because I want to make sure I get it right, but he knows a lot more about the background of this particular place. But when we go to the scripture in the Gospel of Matthew, we find that we're told that Jesus brought his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. Now, you've noticed that it's a little cooler up here, and perhaps in the summer would have been a good time to come up into this area because it would be very hot down in the Galilee. And so more than likely on occasion, Jesus brought his disciples up here to this area. Now, as you look around, you see that it looks like a very religious area, and in fact it was. What this place, I think, really represents is the pagan religious world system of the Greco-Roman world at that time. And this was a place of worship. There was a temple that used to be here in front of this gaping hole that you see. And the temple was set up to worship the god Pan. Now, Pan was this rather bizarre looking half human, half goat god that was worshipped in the Greco-Roman world. You can see behind me some places where that are carved into the rock where there were probably placed some images, perhaps representing other gods. The Greco-Roman world was a very polytheistic world. They worshiped many gods, but what's significant about this place is that the sacrifices that would occur in this temple, and if I understand it right, behind this temple where that hole is, there was a spring that bubbled up in there, which produces the river that you see behind us. And they would sacrifice goats and animals, cast them into the spring, and then they would observe whether there would be blood or parts of the animal that would emerge below them. If it did, then that would be a symbol that the gods had rejected their sacrifice, and if not, they had received it. Now, what was this place called? What was this temple standing in front of? Well, this might shock you, but this was actually called the Gates of Hades. It was believed that this was the entranceway down into Hades, where the god Pan had descended. And so they were offering sacrifices here. And Jesus brings his disciples to this point, to this place, according to Matthew 16, and he has a question and answer time with them, you might say. You remember what the question is he asked? Who do men say that I am? And various answers are given. Some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, or another prophet, Jeremiah, or some other prophet. And he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks up, as he usually did, and he gives the right answer. He says, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. Human teachers didn't tell you this, but my Father in heaven. He says that to Peter here in this area. And then he goes on to say that you are Peter, and upon this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Once again, we see that Jesus is referencing something that they were familiar with. Now, what does all this mean? The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Remember what I said. This represented the religious world system of the Greco-Roman world. The gates of Hades. What are gates? They're defensive, right? The gates of Hades are not going to be able to stop the gospel, is what I think Jesus is saying. The system that dominates the world is not going to be able to stop it. Now, what is the gospel? Because we need to understand what that is. What is the rock? What's the rock that Jesus said, that Jesus is referencing here? Upon this rock, I will build my church. Well, there's some debate about this, isn't there? Roman Catholics think it's Peter. Peter's the rock. Okay? we as Protestants tend to think, now there are some evangelicals who do agree with the Catholics on this, that Peter is the rock, but for the most part we believe that the rock is either Christ or the confession, which is referencing Christ, that Peter gives. And I think that's right. If we look elsewhere in the scripture, we find both Peter and Paul refer to Christ as the rock, as the cornerstone. And Peter talks about this in his epistle. He says Christ is a living stone, and we are all stones built up to make the house of God, he says, the church. Paul talks about Christ being the rock in 1 Corinthians, and being the cornerstone of the church. So I think it makes sense that Peter and Paul would not have understood the rock to be Peter, but rather the rock is Christ. Christ is the rock. He's the foundation for the church. And the gates of Hades are not going to stop it. We know that's true. In a sense, historically, we know that the Roman Empire became Christianized, if you will. So Jesus was, in a sense, making a prophecy, wasn't he? The Greco-Roman religious system was not going to stop the spread of the gospel in the Roman world. The Apostle Paul, the apostles to the Gentiles, spread the gospel throughout the Roman world. We know that. Let me say a little bit more about the Roman Catholic claim here. As some of you know, I have 2 degrees from 2 different Roman Catholic universities, and while I was a student, particularly at Franciscan University, which is a very conservative, evangelistic Catholic university, I developed friendships there. There were those who really tried to convert me to Roman Catholicism. That was their goal. And I try to be as objective as I can. I want to know what the truth is. I don't want to believe something unless I know it's true, unless I'm convinced that it's true. So I was open to their arguments, and I listened to them, and I analyzed them, and I found them to fall well short, especially when it came to their understanding of the Bible and how to interpret the Bible. And one of the key apologetics in Roman Catholicism is the establishment of Rome as the center place of Christianity, and particularly the teaching magisterium and the authority of the popes. Now they use Matthew chapter 16 as the basis for establishing Peter, his primacy, as Christ giving him the authority, because later on he talks about the keys, binding and loosing in that same passage. He has the authority, and that is established in Peter from the statement that was made by Jesus here. This is the Catholic view, right? So Peter becomes the first pope, if you will. He later on goes to Rome, becomes the first bishop of Rome. Now I think we can challenge this. We can already challenge it exegetically based upon what we're looking at in the passage, but historically I think we can challenge this as well. If you study the history of the popes, if you look at the early lists of the popes, Peter's not on any of them. He's not on any of them. In fact, we don't find any reference to Peter even being in Rome until about the middle of the 2nd century, at least with regard to claims made in this respect. Okay? Historically, it's not clear at all whether Peter even went to Rome. There's a tradition that emerged much later about that. In fact, with respect to the Matthew 16 passage, let me add this footnote. There are no references to Peter being the rock in any of the apostolic fathers when they discuss and talk about Matthew 16. None of them make any reference to Peter being the rock. In fact, all of them say that the rock is either the confession or Christ, or both, a combination. None of them ever thought it was Peter. And for good reason. Peter obviously never suggested that he thought it was himself either. He could have easily stated that in his epistles, but he didn't. And so when we examine the historical evidence, it seems like this was a development that was based more on a political situation that was going on as the church began to grow, and there became a desire for establishing Rome as the center, as the political power, versus Constantinople. There was a struggle between East and West that was going on, And I think that's the situation out of which emerged the primacy of Peter. I mean, if you want to establish a center for the church, you're going to need someone who is significant in the Bible and get him there and put him there in order for that to work well. I mean, we have, historically, we have a number of the Gnostic teachers that are in Rome. I think one of the earliest references comes from, I believe it's either these are books that weren't accepted by the church, the Acts of Peter and the Apocalypse of Peter. One was a Gnostic book, the other was never received by the church at all. There's where you find references to Peter being at Rome, but they're really bizarre stories, sort of like the Gnostic Gospels that tell bizarre stories about Jesus that were never accepted by the church in terms of canonicity. We find Simon the sorcerer, which he's talked about in the book of Acts. Remember the story when Jesus confronted, or Peter confronted him? Mm-hmm. Somehow Simon ends up in Rome, and he's doing miracles there. Peter is said to have gone up there to challenge Simon and outdo him in terms of miracles. These are the kind of bizarre stories you find in these books. They were never accepted, but that becomes the basis for what I call the Vatican myth, for Peter's going to Rome, you see. The only possible reference in the New Testament for Peter possibly being in Rome is in his own epistle, 1 Peter 5:13, I believe it is, where he sends his greetings, and he says, we're sending greetings from Babylon. He uses Babylon. Now, some have conjectured that might be a cipher, a code word for Rome, because later on we find it in the 2nd century in particular, we find it in fact becomes that. But remember when Peter is writing, it's before that emerged. But it's quite possible that Peter was actually in Babylon when he said that. Babylon, either the region or the city, because Josephus tells us that there's a group of Jews that lived in Babylon, and Peter, when he was under duress because of Agrippa, he may have made his way up to Babylon to evangelize the Jews in that area. So that may be all that is a reference to his presence in Babylon proper, you see. So another important point that I just want to make here in closing with respect to this, so you probably have heard a lot of sermons based upon Matthew 16, the gates of Hades, the gates of hell. Does this not change your perspective on what that means? The fact that this was a real place, the gates of Hades is a real place right here, and that Jesus is drawing on that to make a point, I think a prophecy, about how the gospel is going to penetrate into that dominant religious worldview at that time, and it wasn't going to be able to stop it. Highly significant, I think. And once again, it shows that understanding, reading the Bible in its geographic context, the place names are important, the geological features are important. The presence of this place is important to understand what Jesus was teaching here at Caesarea Philippi. In the notes, I go into more detail about this, so I would encourage you to look at that. But that just gives you the gist of things here. Great place, isn't it?
It is. Amazing.
So take a look around. Thank you, Chris.